Hi again all. In this video we'll be discussing John Stuart Mill's economic thought. This is part 2 in a 4-part video series covering a few key points in Mill's economic thought. Now my choices in what of course John Stuart Mill's complete set of economic ideas are far too broad and deep to cover in a series of short video lectures. And so the topics I have chosen for these are ones that still have pertinence today, or at least can inform the modern individual working on or working their way through economic ideas. So in this video lecture, we are going to cover one of the more arcane notions of classical economics, but nonetheless one that informs, right or wrong, many people's thinking in the modern era. And in particular, that is the idea of what was referred to as the wages fund and the subsequent concepts of productive and unproductive labor. Now, in structuring this argument, Mill is drawing from David Ricardo of the previous generation, particularly the wages fund style idea of capital accumulation, as well as ideas that date back to Adam Smith, the generation before Ricardo, the ideas of productive and unproductive labor. And what Mill is doing is putting together a lot of ideas in classical economic thought into something that he's attempting to make sort of cohesive. As we mentioned in the previous video, John Stuart Mill's Principles of Political Economy was sort of the first mega textbook in economics. It was the dominant economic textbook for really the latter half of the 19th century. So extremely influential on thinkers of the era, both within the profession and outside of the profession, as well as policymakers for a long period of time. And as we'll see, even some of those ideas still hold sway today. Okay, so let's hop into that. So as I mentioned, this book is still available, right? It's still in print. You can buy a new copy today. And in fact, I believe that's what it looks like right there. So if you go to any bookseller, that you're gonna find it. Old editions, of course, are not that uncommon because it was the dominant textbook for many years. It is perhaps the best summary of classical economic thought, going from Smith to Mill. And really, Mill we're getting towards the end of classical economic thought here. We have yet to cover Marx. And so really excluding Marx, Mill is the culmination of sort of classical economic thought. And as we'll see in the next video, which is actually already up and available, many of the ideas that Marx is going to develop into his main thesis are already very clear here in Mill. Of course, Marx drew very heavily from David Ricardo. Oh, I've put a link here so you have the PowerPoint with the class, right? If somebody's watching this and not part of the class, feel free to email me. I'll send you the PowerPoint. But there's a link to the full text too. It's an old book, right? So it's freely available on the net. Okay, so some key tenets of classical economic thought: labor theory of value, right? So we talked a little bit about that last time. We're going to talk about it again next time. We've talked about it with Ricardo. If you're interested more on the labor theory of value, there's several other videos I have to sort of check out on that. Wages fund doctrine, which we saw before with Ricardo, we're going to look at it here again. The idea that there's limits to economic growth. Classical economic growth generally is not endless growth. Growth sort of winds down and eventually comes to a standstill in all, well, nearly all the classical economists, all the major ones, from Adam Smith through John Stuart Mill, and of course including Marx. Unlike modern economics, right, where modern economics we sort of see growth as being able to proceed indefinitely. The idea of interest as a return to waiting, which is the focus of the next video after this. So a very primitive, and as we'll see in that video, incomplete and therefore unsound explanation for interest. The iron law of wages, which of course we saw in both Ricardo and Malthus, the idea that wages tend towards subsistence. And that is part of the analysis here, although not explicitly discussed in this video. Generally real versus nominal analysis. So we're generally looking at everything is real unless otherwise noted. We're not talking about money values here. We're talking about commodity values. Land rents are a residual payment. It was very explicit in Ricardo. We have a whole video on that. No need to go into it. Again, a system of economy where factor payments precede good payments. In other words, a system of economy where there's sort of a start and a finish. Most economists there are using sort of analogy of a farm, right? In the spring you plant, then you tend the crops over the summer, and in the fall you reap, and then in the spring you start again. So that kind of idea that there's an economic process that starts, proceeds, concludes, and repeats. Of course, we don't think about it that way in modern macroeconomics, right? Modern macroeconomics, everything is simultaneous. Okay. Finally, then, the idea of productive and unproductive labor, where productive labor, or as we'll talk about here, consumption, contributes in some meaningful way to the ongoing capital stock. Okay. All right. Okay, so what we're going to discuss in this one is basic economic growth, or capital accumulation. And in that, this presentation can be found, of course, more deeply in Blaug's Economic Thought in Retrospect, which is our text for this course. Still available, new, of course. And sorry, I've got a lot of distraction going on in the background here. I don't know if you can hear it. All right, I'm just going to roll on from that. Okay, so let's talk about the variables that we're going to, work through this model. So most of these are fairly self-explanatory, right? N is the amount of labor employed. Excuse me. N is the amount of labor employed in fixed proportion with capital, so similar to like we saw with Ricardo. And classical economists, excluding Marx, which is going to cause Marx a whole bunch of problems, as we'll see in a couple weeks, formalize these ideas that we're going to use capital and labor in a fixed dose. And the reason why they're doing that is mathematical expediency, but we'll get that very explicitly in Marx when we see why it's a problem. W is the wages fund, or the amount of real stuff available. So here in this PowerPoint, you see there's a big pile of corn there. That's the idea of a wages fund. Or, right now it's fall outside, so all the squirrels are running around gathering up nuts, right? And storing a pile of nuts for winter. That's the idea of a wages fund. That is, it's a stock of working capital that we can employ to create the next round of production. Okay. A is a labor input coefficient, so that's kind of technical way of saying, like, if I've got N number, if I've got 10 laborers and they produce 100 output, A is 10. Okay. Or if I have 5 laborers, they produce 100 amount of output, then A is 20. Right. So it's just a relationship between the quantity of labor available and the output that labor produces. Okay. And since this is a labor theory of value here, then of course all value is ultimately attributable to labor. Lowercase w is the real wage rate. So this is the amount of stuff, right, that people are paid. And U is the share of consumption that is unproductive. So if you want to think about it like this, remember from Adam Smith, productive labor is labor that contributes to the capital stock. So for example, if I'm going to work and producing a piece of machinery that's going to be utilized in the future to produce more output, that is productive labor. If I'm going to work and making donuts, right, those donuts are going to be consumed by people in the future, And that is not going to contribute to the capital stock of the economy going forward. This is a distinction that classical economists made. There's another video on this, so I've talked about it in great length elsewhere, and so I'm not going to do so here. All right, so start with a couple equations, right? So hopefully nothing too daunting here. The first equation, n in period t is equal to W, or the wages fund in the previous period, divided by W. Okay, all right, so whatever stock of wages fund was available in the previous period divided by the amount that was eaten, right, is the number of available resources in the current period. And we're going to say the W in the current period, this is the second equation, is equal to N, or the number of workers, times A. That's what I was just talking about a minute ago. So if you have 10 workers and they produce 100 output, then A, that relationship is 10. And so therefore then we can state that the wages fund in the current period, or like this stock of corn or stock of acorns, or what do you want to call it, in the current period is therefore the previous round's wages funds times the ratio A to W, or the ratio at which workers are creating new capital stocks, fair enough, new output over the amount that they're using up, or they're eating up literally in the current period. Okay. I hate it when that happens. Okay, adding a final element in, if we take sort of the idea of W0 as a base year, or like a state of nature or something like that, a picture of nature here in this slide. Okay, then we can say that the wages fund in a given time period T is a function of the base year, or the sort of origin point wages fund, what the, like for the squirrels, literally W0 is going to be the acorns that fell this year. Okay, right? Multiplied by A over W times T in the current time period. So in other words, how fast we're constructing versus how fast we're using up. Okay, so adding in the final element of productive and unproductive labor, let's say that a portion every year of sort of fruits of our labor is used up in productive manner, that is to create a new capital. So up to this point we've been sort of assuming that everything goes back into the capital stock, but of course that isn't reality, right? If some share of that is unproductively consumed, to use sort of classical terminology, then it introduces this idea. Now, so the first equation there just says, the number, right? It's the number of workers, okay? WT minus 1 over W, so that's our expression from previously, minus U times that. Okay, so what is U? U is the share of consumption that is essentially unproductive. All right. This is very confusing for somebody who's not spent a lot of time with these ideas. A simple way to understand this is to think about, a family, maybe with one adult and one kid. So that's why there's pictures of kids eating here, okay? And let's say you've got the adult can go to work, but the kid can't go to work. Kids these days, right? Okay, so the kid can't go to work, but the kid's got to eat, okay? So the worker goes to work and makes, 10 pizzas or whatever. Okay, and let's say that the workers, all the pizzas they eat, say they eat 5 pizzas or whatever. All the pizzas they eat allow them to go to work the next day or whatever and build more pizzas or something like that. It's not really quite right, but I think you'll get the analogy. Whereas the kid eats the other 5 pizzas and doesn't go to work. Well, then, of course, only the first 5 pizzas somehow contributes to ongoing production, right? For sure, right? There's 2 kids, right, and they eat, and you got to have more pizzas, right? Because they're all not going to work, but they're all eating. Okay, so this is a sort of rough way to understand this idea in classical economic thought. So if we take that share, like for example, if it's one adult and one kid, like my story, then U is 0.5, okay? Because 5 pizzas eaten by the adult, 5 pizzas eaten by the kid, okay? If the kid only eats 4 pizzas, then, U is 0.4, and the adult is the remainder of that 0.6, right? Okay, all right. So taking that idea then, we can build that into the model and say n is equal to w t minus 1, or the previous, times 1 minus u, or the share of production that is productively consumed, right? Remember the kid example from a moment ago, over w. W, of course, is the wage payment, or of course, it's the pizzas they're eating, to continue that analogy. And so then the model finished, we put all these ideas together. So far, we get this W, right, or the existing capital stock in any given period is then determined by the base year capital stock times this rate of accumulation. The accumulation has additive factors, A, which of course is essentially productivity, right? And it has subtractive factors, U and W. U being the share of output that is unproductively consumed, and W being the rate at which you're consuming output. Okay, so if you think of this as like leftover corn sort of thing, we had some corn to start with, and then how fast is that pile of corn accumulating? Well, it depends upon a couple things. First, how productive are we at growing corn? A, how much of that corn gets eaten up by people who can't make more corn? U, okay? The rate at which you pay corn out in general to people, to workers. W, right? Because U and W represent using up of the corn that you made. So it obviously isn't going to go back into the capital stock. A tells you how much you made in total that could have contributed to the capital stock. So you can see it's really not a very complicated model, right? It's pretty basic and straightforward, okay? And that's sort of a summary of classical economic growth right there. So last slide here, story time, right? I would encourage you going, as you prepare for your responses for this class, or as you think about this, try explaining this to somebody else. And then a couple things will probably happen. One is either you're going to find out you don't really understand what I'm telling you here, and you should probably have a second look at this or look at the text. Or B, what happens is your friend or whatever is like, well, what about this? And then you realize that isn't really covered by the model, because in fact, there is a number of ideas that really aren't very well covered. For example, the capital stock is sort of all, assumed to be working capital rather than fixed capital. There's not a lot of thought to give into the nature of how capital is used in production, or indeed really even what capital is, because here essentially capital is sort of a pile of corn, right, which makes some sense in terms of simple agricultural analogies, but really is a pretty rough description of what physical capital looks like in even an old-timey economy, much less a modern one. Anyway, we'll leave it there. We'll see you next time. Hope this has been informative, and take care.